My name is Robert McHugh. I'm the president of the Millbrook Historical Society. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I especially want to thank St. Joseph's for hosting us, and Father Bancroft and Bishop Bonaventure for being so welcoming. Have this Historical Society event. They're helping to co-sponsor. How many people here, by a show of hands, are members of the Millbrook Historical Society? Oh, that's wonderful. But there are a lot of people who have not raised their hand. And so I strongly encourage you to join the Historical Society. We have a webpage. You can do it through there, millbrookhistoricalsociety.org. If you want to mail a check-in to join, right? We got a P.O. Box 135, right, in the village. Lots of information on the website. And we've also got up front here, Allison just put it on the table, an email collection list. So if you guys are interested in learning more about other programs that we're having, put your email on that. We always email reminders out a few days before the program, so good way to stay informed. We're really excited about the talk on tap here in a minute. Jim Hanna is the vice president of the Catholic Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania. Drove 7 hours, right, to get here. Right, to give this talk. He's going back tomorrow. And so that might be the farthest someone has traveled to give a talk to the Historical Society. Really appreciate it. But from my perspective, you know, as president of the Historical Society and other people who are involved, I think probably have this same view. A lot of times we get questions about local history. So we get emails, people call us up, and they say, I just bought a house here, I'd love to know the history of this house, or I had a relative who lived in Millbrook, do you know anything about this person, can you help us out? And we love getting those inquiries because, you know, that's what we're here for, right, to try to disseminate this knowledge. But when Jim Hanna contacted us last year and said he wanted to come and look at some of the material that we have in the archives, he was sharing with us a story that we had never heard. Right? Story that he's going to tell you about tonight. And that's the best kind of call or email to get, right? Because he's just coming to us and telling us something that's fascinating, something that we didn't know before. And I think you guys are all going to appreciate hearing this story, have the same kind of reaction that we had last year when we first met him. So let me introduce Jim Hanna. Thank him for being here.
Thank you, Robert. So actually, I did not drive 7 hours. Alice only let me drive 3 hours. She took the wheel the other 4. But in any event, we drove as far as Scranton yesterday, so we didn't do it all in one day. We're actually going to Geneva, New York tomorrow to spend a weekend with my brother and his family. So it's a nice time to get away. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you, Bishop Bonaventure, Father Bancroft, and Father Michael Morris is here, who I met with when I was doing my research. He came from Hyde Park, where he's pastor at Regina Celli. So thank you. And thank the Historical Society and the collaboration with the church. I think this is really a great example of what Alice and I have found about Millbrook. This is my 3rd time here, Alice's 2nd time here. I can't be the first outsider who has used this term, the Millbrook spirit. And we find it's palpable here, that there's a sense of community in the short time that we've been here. We've seen it many places. The Millbrook Diner, the Bank of Millbrook, John Bay's gas station. The bishop used to, where he had his gas station back in the 1930s. So appreciate the invite, and thank you all for being here. In researching Bishop Broderick's story, I had to put my detective hat on. Sometimes when you want to tell the full story about someone, you have to dismantle the existing story. It really wasn't much to dismantle because not much had been written about Bishop Broderick. In fact, I have 2 challenges this evening. One is to condense this man's 75-year life into the next 35 minutes, which I think I can do. The greater challenge for me is I'd like to meet your expectations. And so we'll have time for questions at the end. But just by a show of hands, how many feel that they're very familiar with Bishop Broderick's life? Okay. 2. Well, I'll try to, again, meet your expectations. I solved a lot of mysteries too, but one of them that I couldn't solve, but actually asked Jonathan Boyce about it earlier today. The mystery for me is Washington Hollow. Where does it begin? Where does it end? It's like, are there boundaries, you know? But Jonathan helped me out with that. But that's where the bishop had his gas station, and that's where he lived from 1926 to 1939. And I know we're anxious to get him to Millbrook, but you really, to appreciate that, I'm probably playing fast and loose theologically with the word miracle. But I think, for me, I can call it the Millbrook miracle. Bishop Broderick was exiled for 35 years. In my opinion, the victim of uninvited controversies and rumors. Very patient, real model of perseverance. Never spoke ill of the church. Always held himself out as a clergyman and bishop. If you look at every census that he completed, he was a clergyman and bishop. Was often known here in Millbrook, known as a bishop, but referred to often as Dr. Broderick, especially when he wrote columns for the Millbrook Roundtables in the 1930s. But to fully appreciate the Millbrook miracle, which is his reconciliation with the church, when Francis Spellman came here just a few short months after Spellman became Archbishop of New York. In the fall of 1939, he came here and sought out Bishop Broderick. But to fully appreciate that, we have to really look at the entire life of the bishop. This is where he settled down now. This is where he was not only reconciled with the church, but I think he reconciled with himself too. He really fit in the community, and he had done that earlier also in Socrates for a few years. But just to read to you what Edna Tilsley said, and we'll speak more about the Tilsley family later. Dr. Broderick was a very self-effacing and compassionate individual who took enjoyment in making his wine and tending to his own business. He was a well-educated, highly motivated, articulate, and sensitive gentleman who loved to be around people, and a charismatic individual who spread the gospel in a non-clerical way. There was no need for him to preach the gospel. He lived it. And he did live that his entire 75 years. So I think what I'd like to do is maybe give you the geography of his life first, and then I'll color it in a little bit. Well, I think I'll do this first, because even though he doesn't get here till age 57, and how many did research on the internet for Bishop Broderick? Okay. Did you see the gas station mentioned? That always seems to be, that's kind of the hook. But I really think it's not so much a gas station story as it is a Millbrook story. And Millbrook's always mentioned. If you do an internet search, you'll find some misinformation out there. But one misinformation is that he ran the gas station for 40 years. Well, do the math. He reconciled with the church in 1939. Minus 40 years is 1899. There's no gas stations. So that was my first clue that I had to do some detective. But why it is and always will be a Millbrook story. Gentleman, very talented gentleman, Christopher Bailey of Seraph Press, did the formatting and cover design for my book. And this is what he wrote for the back cover. And I share this for two reasons. One, listen to how he begins at Millbrook and ends at Millbrook. But also, Mark Twain once said that the truth is stranger than fiction, because fiction is obligated to stick to probability where the truth isn't. So when you hear some of these uninvited controversies that Bishop Broderick faced in between, and before getting to Millbrook, you'll understand the story a little bit better. But listen to how it begins and ends in Millbrook. And I did not have any input on this. Christopher wrote this himself. He showed it to me, and I said, don't change a word. It's perfect. A Catholic bishop running a gas station? Well, that was the story they told in Millbrook, New York, and it turned out to be true. But the gas station is hardly the most interesting thing about this fascinating character. His is a story of catacombs in Rome, a failed bomb building business in Connecticut, and a sewer system in Cuba. It is a story of allegations, from the serious to the sensation to the silly, that he shared in $1 million commission to sell church property in Havana. that he was living with a nun he stole from a convent in St. Louis, that he was running a hot dog stand in upstate New York. It is a story of a millionaire Congregationalist and his Catholic wife, an impeached governor of New York, quarreling siblings and quibbling church hierarchy. It is a tale of popes and politicians, business partners who throw inkwells at each other, a lawyer who probes into a private papal conversation on behalf of the cardinal of the church. Strange, moving, funny, mysterious, and exciting. This is a story that has fascinated Catholics for years. This is the first book that sifts through the evidence, digs into the mystery, sorts the true from the false, and tells the whole story of the gas station bishop from Millbrook. So it begins and ends in Millbrook, and I think that's the way to do it. So having said the geography of his life, he was born in 1868 in Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut. For the first 20 years of his life, he lives in Hartford and Unionville. His parents are Irish immigrants. In 1889, at the age of 21, he discerns a vocation to the priesthood and goes to Emmitsburg, Maryland, to the seminary for 2 years. 1891, he goes to Rome. He spends most of the 1890s in Rome, studying philosophy, theology. He's ordained in 1896, but he also studies archaeology. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. In 1899, he comes back to Connecticut when his father dies. He spends 1 year in Connecticut. There's a bit of controversy that I'll get into in Connecticut. And then he ends up going to Havana as the American secretary to Bishop Donato Broderick, who is the Bishop of Havana, an Italian. I'll talk about that in a minute. For 2 years. And then 2 years later, he actually becomes auxiliary bishop of Havana, Cuba. That's 1903. In 1905, he has this misunderstanding with Pope Pius X, and this is when his exile begins. He moves to Statsburg in 1905 to 1907. He was there for 2 years, and then in 1908 he buys a house in Yonkers, across the street from Sacred Heart Monastery. Actually, that's the second house he buys in Yonkers, because he buys one earlier when he goes to Havana. But when I color that in, I'll mention that. He's in Yonkers until 1912, and then in 1912 he moves to Saugerties. And he's in Saugerties until 1926 when he comes here. So he spends about the same amount of time in Saugerties that he does here. And he moves to Washington Hollow in 1926. When he reconciles with the church in late 1939, Archbishop Spellman at the time appoints Bishop Broderick as a chaplain to the Scherver Hospital and Home in the Bronx. And so he goes there for the remaining years of his life. He passes away in 1943. So that's sort of the geography. Now to color that in for you, he was the youngest of 3 sons of, again, born in Hartford. He had a brother Clement, a brother David. His father was invested in paper mills in Unionville, Connecticut. There was some money there in the family, and Bonnie, as he was called, began working in the union paper mills in Unionville at age 14. So all through his schooling year, high school years, he was working in a paper mill. And by age 30, he actually saw himself as a rising industrialist. But a year later, perhaps an example of the parish priest, the work of the Holy Spirit, or perhaps his mother was a very devout Catholic, he discerns a vocation to the priesthood. In his own words, he says, I voluntarily abandoned the assured future of wealth and distinction high up in the paper-making industry, because as a priest, I wish to devote my life to the care of souls and the administration of the sacraments. So this is what he discerned at age 21. So imagine his disappointment 13 years later when he's, in essence, expelled from the parish. This was his vocation. He embraced it. And then through the misunderstanding in 1905, he's exiled for 35 years. And that's why I call it the Millbrook miracle, because he perseveres for 35 years, and this is where the reconciliation happens. So as I mentioned, he went to the seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland for 2 years. He goes to Rome, studies under Donato Broderick, who was his theology professor. He also studied under Orazio Marucci, who was the preeminent Christian archaeologist at the time. And Father Broderick at the time, actually becomes a premier graffitiologist. He can study the graffiti in the catacombs of Rome. In fact, he's so good at it. The Times of London in 1898, they wrote of him. They said, "He is a young ecclesiastic with a brilliant future before him in the domain of Christian Science." So this is speculation on my part, but I think if his father hadn't died in 1899 and he came back to Connecticut, things went the way, I think he may have ended up being an archaeologist, spending a lot more time in Rome. But again, that's speculation on my part. That he was very well known, and he also became the first American admitted to the Arcadia, which was a centuries-old Roman literary society. First American admitted to it. So he was quite the student. But while he was in Rome, half the world away, in both directions, we had the war with Spain. And this will change the trajectory of his life. The war in Spain in 1898, a little bit in Cuba, then a little bit longer in the Philippines. Comes back to Connecticut in 1899. There is a clock back there. Alice, when it gets to be 7:40, start going like this. Thank you. See, I'm trying to condense 75 years. In any event, he returns to Rome. He's assigned to a parish in Brantford, Connecticut that needs a new church building. This is where we get the first indication that he's very good in fundraising and with money. And he does have a talent for it. He raises $30,000 to build this new church. $5,000 comes from a name you might be familiar with, Plant. Henry B. Plant, P-L-A-N-T. He was well known for steamships and railroad lines and was really quite instrumental in the development of the state of Florida. So that's in 1899. Also at that time, his brother Clement, who was an inventor, had a contract with the U.S. Navy to build 6-inch projectiles for the Navy Department. And he needed to expand his factory. And Father Broderick convinced the Bishop of Hartford, Bishop Tierney at the time, to invest in the factory. And he did invest $10,000. Then he invested another $5,000 to keep things going, but eventually the factory went bankrupt. And there was an article in the paper, the headline was, "This bishop builds bombs." Okay? So it wasn't good press for Bishop Tierney. And they did nothing wrong. I mean, and Bishop Broderick did, Father Broderick, nothing was done wrong, but it was bad press. And there was a little bit of friction between Bishop Tierney and Father Broderick. And wouldn't you know, by coincidence, Donato Beretti, his former professor from Rome, became the Bishop of Havana, Cuba, following the war with Spain. And so he invites Father Broderick to go to Havana with him as his secretary. And Bishop Tierney gratefully gave Father Broderick a leave of absence to go there. So that's how he ends up in Havana, Cuba. And they were tasked with taking care of church property. Following the war with Spain, we're used to separation of church and state, and we were at the time, but Spain was not. There was no separation of church and state. Spain was a Catholic country. The state supported the churches, all the property, church property in Havana. A lot of it was being used by the government. So there was no separation of church and state there. So the quagmire was what to do with all this church property. Who owns it? Does the government own it? How do we get our property back? How do we get rid of what we don't need? And Broderick was tasked with that. He did a great job on it. And in 1 year, he did such a good job in 1 year that Pope Leo XIII at the time, when Broderick come to Rome, and Broderick was made a Monsignor at age 32. And a lot of that was in recognition of the good work that he did in settling the church property question in Havana. So that's 1903. He becomes bishop in 1903 at age 34. And during his time, with the infrastructure needs in Cuba, everything needed to be rebuilt. There were no sewer systems at the time. I mean, it was just really bad. Yellow fever was a big problem, and Cuba was a mess, and a lot of rebuilding needed to be done. And the Americans occupied Cuba for a few years before we turned it over to them. So a lot of American companies. A lot of companies from Connecticut were involved in the rebuilding of Cuba. And another Broderick brother, David, not Clement, but David was, for lack of a better term, a manufacturer's rep for a lot of Connecticut companies. And he was in Cuba representing these companies. And Bishop Broderick had made a lot of connections with a lot of folks in military at the time. General Leonard Wood was the military governor of Connecticut, or Cuba. There was former congressman, in fact, William Salzer, who eventually became a governor of New York, was a congressman that was involved with the Ways and Means Committee in directing business down there. John Sullivan from Massachusetts, and a number of us. Broderick was very well connected with them. And this is where we see a kind of first Millbrook connection. One of the connections he made was with a contractor from Boston by the name of Hugh Riley. And Hugh Riley came to the bishop with letters of recommendation from a gentleman named John Crimmins. Now, who was John Crimmins? John Crimmins was a wealthy philanthropist, very involved in supporting Catholic causes from New York City. But he was vice president of the Trust Company of America. Who was president? Oakley Thorne. So Crimmins shows up with these letters of recommendation, or Riley shows up with these letters of recommendation. What happens next is, not to get into too much of how the organization is, but Archbishop Chappelle was the apostolic delegate who oversaw what was happening in Cuba. And I think Bishop Broderick was so popular with the Cubans, with the politicians in Cuba, with the people in Cuba, with government officials, General Leonard Wood. There were some folks that were a little bit, I think, jealous of that popularity. And these rumors started to spread that his brother David was getting special consideration for some of these contracts. Okay, David was just a good businessman. And there's another conflated accusation that Bishop Broderick had conspired to share in this $1 million commission to sell church property in Havana. So this was a rumor. He was an easy target, and this was a rumor that circulated. And Archbishop Chappelle heard this. He goes in the fall of 1904 to Rome, and when he gets to Rome to see Pius X, Pope Pius X at the time, to file these complaints or accusations that he wants the Vatican to look into. Well, Bishop Broderick had done nothing wrong, and he's got to defend himself. And he gets on a boat, and he follows Archbishop Chappelle to Rome. And he goes to Rome, and he defends himself to Pope Pius X. And the Pope believes him, as well he should. The Pope says, you know what, you're very good at handling financial matters. You've proven yourself. But rather than send you back to Cuba, let's have you go to Washington, D.C. I'd like you to make you auxiliary bishop to Cardinal Gibbons out of Baltimore at the time. I'd like you to be in charge of something called Peter's Pence, which is a collection that supports some of the ministries that flow out of the Vatican. And a very important national collection called Peter's Pence. We want you to be in charge of that. And Bishop Broderick accepts that. I think he'd rather do something else, but he accepts it. Okay, well, that's what I'll do. Well, he gets to Washington, and Cardinal Gibbons is not happy. I think a little bit of it is because Bishop Broderick's unwarranted reputation had preceded him. And I think some of the bishops thought, well, we don't really need a bureaucracy to handle this collection. We can take care of it ourselves. For whatever reason, Cardinal Gibbons decides he doesn't like the process that's playing out. And so he contacts Pope Pius X, and the Pope says, well, okay, I'm going to have to pull the plug on this. And he does. And Bishop Broderick is left sort of in limbo. He's like, well, I don't have an assignment. I was given a $100 a month pension, interim pension, when I left Rome with this assignment, but I don't have a job. And he writes a letter. I think this is sort of probably too strong to say it was a self-inflicted wound, because his intention wasn't as it was understood in Rome. And I'm not sure if it was misunderstanding the interpretation language difficulties or what, but the Pope misinterprets the bishop's letter. The bishop writes and says, I don't have a job, and I'm a bishop, and bishop of the United States without an assignment, it could appear to be a scandal. Well, Pope Pius X misunderstands that. He thinks that Bishop Broderick is threatening to cause a scandal, and that's not the case at all. And so that's what kind of ruptures the relationship. It's a misunderstanding about the letter that Bishop Broderick wrote. And so he ends up without an assignment. And it's a mystery to me why Pope Pius X remained as Pope for the next 10 years and didn't contact Broderick. So I haven't solved that mystery. But Bishop Broderick is still a bishop and doesn't have an assignment. He has his $100 a month pension. He has an idea that he's been toying with because he spent so much time in Italy, and that is to resettle Italian immigrants on farm property in the southern United States. And so he's exiled early in 1905. By November of 1905, he's in the White House with Theodore Roosevelt. And he's explaining this plan he has to resettle Italian immigrants. And they form, with Theodore Roosevelt's approval, the Italian American Agricultural Association. And they start to resettle Italian immigrants in the South. And they have a whole plan for doing this, little communities. But it doesn't last long. It's very short-lived for a number of reasons. But while this is all going on, the gentleman I mentioned from Boston, Hugh Riley, was involved in Cuba in building new aqueducts, water systems, and sewer systems. And he knows that Bishop Broderick has a good relationship with immigrants and finding laborers. And he goes to Bishop Broderick and says, you met me in Havana. I'm down there working, and I need laborers. Could you help me get some laborers? And so they strike up this new relationship. And one of the subcontractors in the Boston company named Donovan and Phillips. And Donovan and Phillips are the business partners that throw inkwells at each other. And they end up wanting to get out of the business. And Hugh Riley introduces Bishop Broderick to John Sullivan, former congressman from Massachusetts. And Bishop Broderick and John Sullivan buy the Donovan and Phillips company. And so they're now in the sewer system building business in Cuba. So he has to earn a living. And he's very ambitious, and he wants to move forward with his life as best he can. So they do that. It's a $4 million project, and they work on that for a number of years. And I think it's actually 1912 when it's finally finished, and that's when he moves to Socrates. And there's some, 1912 and 1913, there's a lot of, the bishop unfortunately spends a lot of time in the courtroom. He sues a magazine. Pearson's magazine had repeated this accusation about the real estate commission. And Bishop Broderick says, no, he sues the magazine and he wins. The magazine retracts what they had said about him. David, his brother, went to work for the Donovan and Phillips company, and he did the on-site management in Cuba, and Bishop Broderick was sort of domestic affairs from Socrates. Well, David withheld some funds from Mr. Riley and from the bishop, and all three of them ended up suing each other. It ends up in court, but they settled amicably in 1914. So 1912, 1914, he's in Socrates, and he's in Barclay Heights. He has an estate up there, and he was farming at the time. He had a little bit of an interest in farming. He was doing that. But in 1914, after 2 years in Barclay Heights, he sells that property and moves down to 70 Main Street. And I think the house is still there. There's a funeral home, and there's a yellow house next door to it, and I think it's the yellow house, but it's on 70 Main Street in Socrates. He moves there with his mother and a woman by the name of Helen Boland, who had been his mother's caretaker and caregiver since 1901. And Helen is another story. And we can get into that maybe in the question and answer here in a few minutes. But he moves there with Helen Boland and his mother. His mother's in failing health. And they moved down to Main Street in 1914. In 1917, his mother passes away. And one thing we know about Bishop Broderick is that he was a wordsmith. And we know that because he wrote for the Millbrook Round Table. But I want to read to you what he wrote about the scene when his mother died in Socrates in 1917. If I can find it here. Got everything on the order. And he wrote this in a journal that I found in the Archdiocese of New York archives. He wrote this later in life. His handwriting, Bishop Broderick's health was always a question mark. His handwriting at the end of his life was very unstable, but I was able to make it out. I found it easier in that journal than I find it here tonight. So when his mother dies, it's right at the beginning of the First World War. And he ends up with some Socrates names that you might know. John T. Washburn, the brickmaking family, Mayor William Ziegler, banker John Snyder, and Martin Canteen of the paper company. They end up opening up something called the Ethan Allen Military Training Camp in North Hero, Vermont. And it's sort of like a military school, summer for training young men that might go into the Army. And they run that for a few years together. And then around 1920, Martin Canteen takes it over and changes it to a Lakes Champlain vacation camp. Bishop Broderick goes up there. He's traveling between Socrates and North Hero quite a bit. And he goes up there and actually manages the vacation camp, has a little cabin up there. So, as I talk, I'm still looking for this wonderful thing that the bishop wrote. So his mom dies in 1917, and she was, I think, 85 years old at the time. But he stays in Socrates on Main Street until 1926. And in 1926, he moves to Washington Hall. Now, why does he move to Washington Hall? So Edna Tildesley was interviewed in the late 1980s. If you recall, Edna's husband, John, was the editor and publisher of the Millbrook Roundtable from 1930 on. The paper was founded, as most of you know, by William Tildesley, so it was Edna's father-in-law in the early 1900s. And I think he moved to Texas around 1930. But Edna seems to think that William, her father-in-law, had offered Bishop Broderick, knowing that he was a wordsmith, when he was in Socrates, had offered him a job to come to Millbrook and write for the Roundtable. And so that's the best guess I have at why he came to Millbrook. But nonetheless, I couldn't find any indication that he began writing for the Roundtable until 1935. It could have been earlier, but I found no articles prior to 35. But he comes here to Washington Hall in 1926. He buys 70 acres of land next to Washington Hall Cemetery. He buys it from the heirs of Webster Knickerbocker, is the name. Webster Knickerbocker had died, I think, in the 19-teens. But Bishop Broderick buys the 70 acres with a farmhouse. This is before he has a gas station. He has a 70-acre property. Interestingly, the deed was in the name of Helen Bolden, his mother's caregiver and housekeeper. And when Mom died in 1917, Helen stayed on as the bishop's housekeeper. So she moves to Washington Hall with the bishop. And the property actually was in her name. She sells it in 1941. So he's here, and so what's he doing here? It's kind of a mystery to some people. I mean, everybody knows he's a bishop in the Catholic Church. And in the Poughkeepsie News-Eagle, there was an article in 1929, and this is one reason why we know he didn't have a gas station early on, because in 1929, the Poughkeepsie News-Eagle wrote this: Bishop Broderick has lived at Washington Hollow a number of years. He has become acquainted with many persons living near him and has become an established member of the community. Stories of the former bishop of Hanna living in seclusion in a wayside farmhouse at Washington Hollow and conducting a hot dog stand led many to ask why a clergyman was living apart, apparently having no connection with the church. church. So, if he had a gas station, we would have known it in 1920. Did he have a hot dog stand? Well, here's what he said. And he wrote this to the Poughkeepsie News-Eagle and they printed it. Hot dog stand? Certainly not. I do not run a hot dog stand or any other kind of stand. That is the product of the imagination of some newspaper. These young fellows write principally from their imaginations, I guess. It will be remarkable if we ever see youth and brains together. But he wants to explain why he's a clergyman without a church. He goes on to say, people do not understand the organization of our church. They think that because a clergyman does not preach every Sunday and have a church that he is unattached. There is a difference between a bishop and a parish priest, you know. I am certainly not unattached. I am connected with the diplomatic service of the church. So what he's thinking of here is when he had that assignment to run the Peter's Pence collection back in 1905. Now here we are 24 years later, and he still has that in his heart. He's still waiting, he's waiting for orders from Rome. He's connected with it. This is not the first time he mentions diplomatic connection with the church. He's done that a couple of times in the past. But this is what he told the Poughkeepsie News-Eagle. So when did he open the gas station? Well, I talked to Kevin DeMartine, who has the bottle shop antiques down there in that property. And Kevin actually, when Helen Boland sold the property in 1941, she sold it to Kevin's mother, whose name was Evelyn. And so Kevin seems to think that, and I would agree, it was probably around 1935 when the Taconic State Parkway, which I think then was known as the Eastern State Parkway, when it first came up to what is now Route 44, when they first opened an exit there. Kevin seems to think that his gas pumps were the first ones there when they opened that. That would have been 1935. Anything you see on the internet that he ran a gas station for 30 or 40 years is not, that's incorrect. So, my best guess, our best guess is that he had it from 1935 on. And that's about the time he starts to write for the Millbrook Roundtable. So, some Millbrook connections when he's here, and we'll get to the Millbrook area shortly. Some connections that he made here were, of course, the Tildesley and Dr. Thomas White. This one's interesting. Dr. Thomas White. I mentioned Broderick's health was always a question mark. Dr. Thomas White had a practice on Franklin Avenue somewhere. Probably lived and practiced in the same building, I'm thinking. Broderick was an avid golfer, as was Dr. White. And they played golf together at the Millbrook Golf and Tennis Club. But Dr. White and his wife also hosted Dr. Broderick at social events. I found some articles where they had dinner parties together, etc. But this is an interesting connection. Dr. White's wife, Elizabeth, her maiden name was Greer, and she was the sister of Reverend Ross Greer of, Grace Episcopal Church. So the Greers came from Atlanta. And I found a wedding announcement when Dr. Thomas White married Elizabeth Greer, who came from Atlanta. They made a big deal in the Atlanta Constitution in the wedding announcement that she was a descendant of the family of Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy. But Alexander Stephens' mother was a Greer. And so it was Alexander Stephens' uncle that the Greers descended from. Interestingly, when you see the wedding announcement in New York newspapers, there's no mention of the Confederacy. Another friend of his was John Pingree, who was president of the Bank of Millbrook for 17 years. In fact, one of Bishop Broderick's articles in the Millbrook Roundtable was sort of a eulogy to John Pingree when he passed away in 1938. The title of it is Great of Heart and Soul, He Walked Humbly Among Us. So he and John Pingree were very good friends. And Edna Tilsley considered Bishop Broderick part of their family. They spent a lot of time together. So, what happens in 1939 is, to get to the miracle, Francis Spellman becomes Archbishop of New York in May of 1939. And it's really incredible to me that he finds out about Broderick the way he does. And Leto Ciccignani was the apostolic delegate to the United States. And he goes to Francis Spellman on the eve of his consecration to become Archbishop of New York, at that time the third largest archdiocese in the country. He's going to have a lot on his plate. And he's becoming Archbishop of this archdiocese in New York. He's going to have a lot to do. But Bishop Ciccignani goes to Spellman on the eve of his consecration and brings to his attention 4 serious matters. One of them is this retired prelate living in Millbrook, New York. Okay, so he makes it like a priority and brings it to Spellman's attention. And there's things were working years earlier to bring justice to Bishop Broderick. The wheels of justice had started turning years earlier, I think about 1933, if not earlier. But finally, for many reasons, the door opened for Ciccignani to bring this to someone's attention. And Archbishop Spellman becoming the new Archbishop, that was the opening. And Archbishop Spellman wasted very little time. That was in May. He came up here in, around the end of August, early September. And he came up here to receive a gift from Oakley Thorne, which was the property over here, the 50 acres, which was, I think, called the Chancellor Estate at the time. It became the Cardinal Hayes home. So Spellman came up here to receive that gift from Oakley Thorne. While he's here, and nobody knew this except Archbishop Spellman. Even Father John Dahey, who was the pastor here at St. Joseph's, had no idea that Archbishop Spellman had another intention coming here. He wanted to seek out Bishop Broderick. So he goes to Father Dahey after they have the ceremony where he receives the gift of his property. And he says, "Do you know where Bishop Broderick lives?" "Yes." "Will you drive me there?" And he does. He drives him there. And he says to him, "Drop me off." And if you look at where the Bay gas station is now, the mobile station, about maybe 30 yards to the right, there's kind of a pathway that goes up. And there's a little piece of asphalt there. And Kevin DeMartini confirmed this for me. That would have been the pathway that Spellman would have walked to the farmhouse behind the gas station. And all right. So he has Father Dahey drive him out there. And he has him drop him off. He doesn't want any attention brought to him. And so he says, "Just drop me off and drive down the road, please." And I walk up the path. And so he does that. And Spellman's the only one that knows what's going on. And of course, the Bishop Broderick's not expecting him. And I should have numbered these pages. So this is what Francis Spellman, in his own words, what happened. He walks up the path. Now, Spellman's 50 years old. Broderick's 70 years old. And not expecting somebody to come to his door, let alone the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of New York. This is what Francis Spellman wrote. "I knocked on the door, and it was opened by a man of about 70 years of age, dressed plainly in rough clothes. I said, 'Good afternoon, Dr. Broderick. I am Archbishop Spellman, and I heard that you were here, and I thought I would come to see and ask you if there was anything I could do to help you.' Immediately and spontaneously came his answer. 'I have been waiting 30 years for someone to say those words to me.'" So if you want an example of perseverance and patience as a virtue, it has to be Bishop Bonaventure Broderick. And Spellman did his due diligence. He talked to a lot of people that knew Bishop Broderick, all the way back to some of his seminarians back in Maryland, even, that were now bishops. And to a one, they all confirmed he was the victim of uninvited controversy. I mean, rumor and innuendo, and he did nothing wrong. And one of those character references wrote, he did a work in Cuba that I believe could not have been done by any other man available at the time. So Spellman did all his due diligence, including interviewing Helen Boland, and on December 1st, 1939, he appointed Bishop Broderick, brought him back into the church, appointed him chaplain of the Sherver Hospital and Home in the Bronx, and he lived there for 4 years. It was run by the sisters of Franciscan sisters. I think there were 40 sisters. He became chaplain to them as well as the residents and patients. In 1942, he became vicar for religious, and he dies in 1943. So he and Spellman were very close those last few years. And they were so close that in 1942, when a new wing was added to the Sherver Hospital and Home, the wing was being dedicated. And this is at least a year before Bishop Broderick dies. And he's still the chaplain at the home. He might have been vicar for religious at the time. But Archbishop Spellman goes to dedicate this wing. And imagine, this is what Spellman said, imagine someone saying this about you, or you saying this about another person. This is what Spellman said about Bishop Broderick. The greatest thing I have done for my soul, and the greatest gift I have brought to the people of the Archdiocese, has been in bringing Bishop Broderick to New York. I mean, what a wonderful thing to say about someone. I mean, imagine how much respect they have for each other. So that's, to me, is the Millbrook miracle. And so I'll take any questions you have. Thank you for your patience. And I didn't see you waving at 7. I did. So, questions?
Detail.
Yes.
I did read your book. Thank you for writing this. It's a beautiful book. And you mentioned something about the work that he did in Rome, and that years later, because of his work with St. Peter's tomb, they believe that because of what he did in Rome, that they were able to discover some more about St. Peter's tomb.
Yeah. So I think in the Archdiocese of New York archives, there's a letter when they were digging for St. Peter's tomb. There was a letter written to Bishop Broderick, and I forget what year that was, with a copy of the article. It was in, I think, the New York Times. And this lawyer wrote to Bishop Broderick, must have been a friend of his, saying, I thought you'd be interested in reading this. The work that you started when you were in Rome, it has sort of led to this, I think. And I think it had to do with, he was a pioneer in studying graffiti in the catacombs, the etchings on the walls. I think that's what it had to do with. Yeah. Does that help? Yeah.
I have a question. When you mentioned William Tilsley possibly being one to draw him over here, Sardides, were there any correspondence on that, or is that sort of intuition that maybe that's how it happened?
That was so Edna Tilsley was interviewed in the late 1980s by a seminarian from Emmitsburg, Maryland, the same seminary that Broderick went to decades earlier. He was writing a thesis for his master's degree in church history. And he came here and interviewed Edna. And so that could have been her speculation, but that was what he put in his thesis, that Edna thought that William that was one reason why he came here. So, couldn't really confirm that.
It's a nice connection.
But he came here in 1926, and 3 years later, they think he runs a hot dog stand. So.
Where is he buried?
Thank you. Where's he buried? He's buried in Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, in the shadow of Babe Ruth. No, he was a golfer. So he enjoyed golf. And he played a lot of golf in Cuba with General Leonard Wood and some of the other golfers. Could be.
You have to build a story in about Helen Bolin then, and where she's buried.
Oh, so yeah, and Helen Bolin, so his housekeeper. This was one of the most challenging things. And one of the things I like about research and the detective work is uncovering things that are hard to uncover. So, who was Helen Bolin? I read the back cover where there's this fabrication that he was living with a nun he stole from a convent. So Helen Bolin was, she was a novice in the convent in St. Louis, and she was sent to Cuba at age 21 to help open a reform school for girls after the war with Spain. So imagine the culture shock. You're coming from St. Louis, 21-year-old. You're going to open a reform school for girls in 1900 in Havana, Cuba. And she discerned that she didn't have the gifts for this. And at the same time, Bishop Broderick, I didn't mention this, but there was thinking that he and Bishop Bonaventure were going to be sent to the Philippines. And he had moved his mother, who was widowed at the time, to Yonkers, at Tower Place, in their Sacred Heart Monastery. And he could travel fairly, I mean, it wasn't too bad to go from Havana to New York by boat, but the Philippines is a different story. He wanted a caregiver, a housekeeper, and a companion for his widowed mother in Yonkers. And when Helen discerned that she didn't have the gifts for religious life, she went to Yonkers to care for Bishop Broderick's mother. But who was Helen Bolin? I mean, the breakthrough for me, for you historians who are interested in research, there aren't that many Helen Bolins out there, B-O-W-L-E-N. I went through everything, all the different websites. Well, the breakthrough came when I went to the Archdiocese of New York Archives and found letters from Pablo Desvernon, who was the Secretary of State for Cuba. He and Broderick were very good friends. Broderick didn't keep very much correspondence, but there were a lot of letters from Pablo. And every letter ended with, give my best to Helen, regards to Helen, say hello to Helen. But one of them said, best wishes to Helena. Oh, there's an A on the end. Well, that was the breakthrough. I found that Helena, Sister Mary of St. Helena, Bolin. So just finding that little A in a letter was the breakthrough to find Helen. But she was a former nun who discerned out a religious life and became his mother's caregiver and companion, and then later his housekeeper. I think he was always concerned for her health too. In fact, I think that may be one reason why the property wasn't deeded in her name. If something happened to him, she had that. He made arrangements for her to be taken care of at the Sherber Hospital in home, same place he was. And he died in 43, and I think she passed away at 47 or 48. So, yeah. Yes?
Did she worship here at St. Joseph's?
Well, the bishop said Mass in his home daily. I mean, that was another thing that came up. And there was a pastor in Socrates told the Poughkeepsie News Eagle, look, Father Broderick says Mass in his home daily. And there's some other correspondence between the priest in Socrates and Cardinal Farley at the time, Archbishop Farley, that his mother, the bishop said Mass in his house daily, and his mother received communion at his Masses. So whether she came, I don't know. Yeah. Yes?
I can't remember if you mentioned this, this, but what sparked your interest in this particular story, and how long have you been doing research and writing the book?
Well, make a long story barrel. I read a, this is going to sound like it has no connection, but it does. I read a biography of Jack Kerouac, and in that biography it says that Jack Kerouac met Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, at a party in New York City given by the photographer Robert Franks. I'm like, what? How does Thomas Merton get out of the monastery in Kentucky to go to a party in New York where he meets Jack Kerouac? So I started doing internet research, and I started putting in different search terms. And one of them was St. Bonaventure College, where Merton once taught. I just went down this rabbit hole. The internet started unraveling. I did all these different stories, and somehow I had Bonaventure in it. I find this story about this bishop that ran a gas station. Then I saw 40 years, that can't be true. I have to look into this. So I think about 2 years. About 2 years. But that's the fun part, the research, for me anyway. Yes.
You mentioned 3 things when we got into the next question.
Do you have a good collection of the articles that you wrote for the Millbrook?
There's a few up here, and I got these from the Millbrook Library. They're very helpful.
Mark, they're wonderful.
Very wonderful, yeah. That's part of that Millbrook spirit that we discussed. I only saw them at least when I was there last year. They showed me how to bring them up on the screen. And so when I printed them out, they're very small. But they have most of them there. But the earliest ones that we could find were from 1935. But they're all at the library. Yes?
When we met at the diner this morning, and you mentioned Helen Boland, that's when I realized that we had met about 3 years ago at the gas station.
I know.
Which is incredible, really.
When I came up here to do my research, I went to the gas station. I'm talking to the gentleman behind the counter, asking him some questions, and Jonathan walks in and overhears me. Well, here we are today. We met down at the diner. I think we know each other. Small world.
Millbrook magic.
Thank you.
Encourage people to sign up with the email list here. Our next program is in a month, May 18th at Innisfree. Another one kind of off-site for us. So there's more information about that on the website. Please come up and take a look at some of the material that Jim brought. And I just want to thank him because he talked about Francis Spellman doing this act of service and bringing Bishop back into the fold. And I think you have done equally important work, kind of resurrecting this story and preserving it for future generations.